The crystal wine glass shattered against the fence, inches from Eliza's face. Droplets of Merlot splashed across her cream blouse like bloodstains as shards of glass scattered at her feet. Her Uncle Richard's face contorted with rage, his 6'2" frame looming over her as he cornered her against the garden trellis. "You think you're so much better than everyone else now, don't you?" he hissed, his breath reeking of alcohol and resentment. Little Miss Perfect with her fancy house and her fancy husband. Panic froze Eliza in place as childhood fears resurfaced like ghosts. Then a shadow fell across them both. "Get away from my wife." The voice was calm, but carried a deadly undercurrent that promised consequences. In that moment, as her husband David stepped between them, Eliza realized that today would finally end the nightmare that had haunted her family for years. The morning had started so differently. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom curtains of their colonial-style home in Oak Ridge Heights as Eliza Mason carefully applied her mascara, her hand trembling slightly. The annual family barbecue, always held at their house on the first Saturday of summer, was a tradition she normally looked forward to. This year, however, a knot of dread had settled in her stomach. "Are you sure we can't call and say he's not welcome?" David asked, adjusting his watch as he stood behind her. Their eyes met in the mirror, and Eliza saw the concern etched on her husband's face. "He's my father's brother, David. Dad would be heartbroken if I banned Richard from a family event." David's jaw tightened. "Your father needs to understand what kind of man his brother really is." Eliza sighed, setting down her mascara. "It's just one afternoon. He usually behaves himself at these things. Too many witnesses." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. David placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "One wrong move, Liz. That's all it will take, and I'm throwing him out." She covered his hand with hers, drawing strength from his touch. "I know, but let's try to keep the peace. For Dad's sake." At 32, Eliza had built a life that was worlds away from the chaotic household of her childhood. A successful interior designer with her own boutique firm, she had married David, a criminal defense attorney, 3 years ago. Their renovated colonial home with its sprawling backyard was the perfect setting for family gatherings, a testament to how far she'd come. Yet Uncle Richard remained a persistent shadow from her past, a reminder of vulnerabilities she thought she'd outgrown. Eliza busied herself in the kitchen, preparing potato salad and marinating chicken while David set up tables and chairs in the backyard. As she chopped celery, memories intruded, Richard's booming voice during holiday gatherings, his cruel comments disguised as jokes, the way her mother would flinch when he entered a room. Once, when Eliza was 12, she'd witnessed him grab her Aunt Margaret's wrist so hard it left bruises shaped like fingerprints. Margaret had left him shortly after, disappearing from family functions and eventually moving across the country. Nobody talked about why. The doorbell rang at noon, jolting Eliza from her thoughts. "I'll get it," David called from the hallway. Relief washed over her when she heard her father's warm greeting. Thomas Bennett entered the kitchen with arms outstretched, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "There's my girl," he said, enveloping her in a hug that smelled of Old Spice and comfort. At 67, her father had softened around the middle but retained the strength that had carried their family through her mother's illness and eventual passing 5 years ago. Behind him stood her younger sister, Melody, holding her 2-year-old daughter, Lily. "The place looks amazing as always," Liz, Melody said, setting Lily down. The toddler immediately ran to Eliza, arms raised in a demand to be picked up. "Someone's getting so big," Eliza said, lifting her niece and breathing in her baby shampoo scent. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps Richard wouldn't show up at all. That hope withered when, 30 minutes later, a rumbling engine announced the arrival of Richard's vintage Mustang. Eliza watched from the kitchen window as he emerged, a 6-pack of beer dangling from one hand. At 59, Richard Bennett still cultivated the image of a man 20 years younger, tight t-shirts to show off gym-sculpted arms, designer jeans, and hair dyed an unnatural shade of brown. "Showtime," David murmured beside her, his hand finding the small of her back. "Remember, I'm right here." By now, the backyard was filling with extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, and a few close friends who might as well have been blood relatives. The grill sizzled as David took charge of the cooking, while Eliza circulated with drinks and conversation. Richard made his entrance with characteristic loudness, slapping backs and bellowing laughs that seemed designed to command attention. For the first hour, Eliza successfully maintained her distance, gravitating towards safer relatives and busying herself with hostess duties. She noticed Richard had brought a date, a nervous-looking blonde woman who appeared at least 15 years his junior. Eliza caught her eye across the yard and offered a sympathetic smile. The woman seemed to relax slightly, separating from Richard to chat with Melody by the dessert table. That's when Richard, already 3 beers in, began scanning the gathering with predatory focus. Eliza felt his gaze land on her like a physical weight. She turned away quickly, heading toward the kitchen for more ice, heart pounding against her ribs. Need any help? Her cousin Michael appeared at her side, his presence a welcome buffer. Actually, yes. Can you grab the extra cooler from the garage? She asked, grateful for the distraction. As they walked, Michael lowered his voice. He's already drunk, Liz. Dad says we should cut him off before he gets worse. Michael's father, Uncle James, was the middle Bennett brother, quieter than Thomas or Richard, but steadfast in his disapproval of Richard's behavior. When Eliza returned to the yard, she found Richard holding court near the grill, regaling a group of younger male cousins with stories of his glory days. Taught that punk a lesson he never forgot, he was saying, punching one fist into his palm for emphasis. David caught Eliza's eye from across the yard, giving a subtle nod toward Richard. The message was clear, he was watching. The afternoon progressed, and Eliza began to think they might make it through without incident. The food was a hit, conversations flowed, and even the weather cooperated with perfect early summer sunshine. Then came the toast. Thomas, slightly tipsy on wine and sentimentality, clinked his glass for attention. I'd like to thank my beautiful daughter and her wonderful husband for hosting us again this year, he began, voice thick with emotion. Looking around at all of you, I can't help but think how proud Caroline would be to see our family together like this. At the mention of Eliza's mother, a hush fell over the gathering. To family, Thomas concluded, raising his glass. To family, echoed the guests, all except Richard, who snorted audibly. Yeah, to family, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Some more successful than others, right, Tommy? Thomas's smile faltered. This isn't the time, Rich. Richard pushed away from the table where he'd been sitting. It never is it? Little Princess Eliza gets to play hostess in her perfect house with her lawyer husband, while the rest of us, that's enough, David interjected, stepping forward. Richard swung toward him, eyes narrowing. Here comes the knight in shining armor. Tell me, counselor, does it bother you that your wife comes from trash like me? That her blood is my blood? Eliza felt her chest tighten as conversations around them died. Lily began to whimper, sensing the tension, and Melody quickly hustled her inside. Uncle Richard, Eliza said, trying to keep her voice steady. Why don't I get you some coffee? Her uncle's gaze swung toward her, and the malice in his eyes made her stomach lurch. Don't patronize me, girl. You think I don't see how you look down on me? Just like your mother did. The mention of her mother ignited something in Eliza, a spark of anger that momentarily overshadowed her fear. Don't you dare talk about my mother, she said, her voice low but firm. A murmur ran through the gathered family members. Richard's face darkened. I'll talk about whoever I damn well please. Caroline was a stuck-up bitch who thought she was too good for this family the minute she married your father. Thomas stepped forward then, his face ashen. That's it, Richard. You need to leave. Oh, now you grow a backbone? Richard sneered. 30 years too late, brother. He turned back to Eliza. Your mother poisoned this family against me. And now you're doing the same thing. Eliza felt David's presence behind her, a silent support. No one is poisoning anyone against you, Uncle Richard, she said calmly. Your behavior speaks for itself. A dangerous quiet fell over Richard. Without breaking eye contact with Eliza, he addressed the gathering. The party's over for me, folks. Seems I'm not welcome in the princess's castle. As Richard stalked toward the side gate, his date hurried after him, shooting an apologetic glance back at the group. The tension slowly dissipated as people resumed conversations in hushed tones. David placed a gentle hand on Eliza's shoulder. You okay? She nodded, though her heart was still racing. I'm going to check on Dad. Thomas had settled heavily into a lawn chair, looking suddenly older than his years. I'm sorry, sweetheart, he said as she approached. He's been worse since he lost his job at the plant. That doesn't excuse it, but... He trailed off, his expression troubled. It's not your fault, Dad, Eliza assured him, squeezing his hand. Let's just enjoy the rest of the day. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wouldn't let the confrontation end there. An hour later, most of the guests had departed. Only immediate family remained: Thomas, Melody with her husband and Lily, and Uncle James with his wife, Aunt Patricia. They sat around the patio table, the conversation deliberately light as they picked at leftover desserts. Eliza excused herself to begin clearing dishes, grateful for a moment alone to gather her thoughts. In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. The confrontation with Richard had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Memories surfaced. Richard yelling at her mother during a Thanksgiving dinner years ago, his face contorted with the same rage she'd glimpsed today. The back door creaked open, startling her. Just me, David said, carrying a stack of plates. The others are heading out. Your dad wants to know if he should stay and help clean up. Eliza shook her head. Tell him to go home and rest. We can handle this. David set down the plates and drew her into an embrace. You were amazing out there, he murmured against her hair. She melted into his arms, allowing herself to feel protected for a moment. I just wish he wasn't part of our lives at all, she whispered. After saying goodbye to the remaining family members, Eliza and David worked in companionable silence, restoring order to their home. The summer evening was cooling, a gentle breeze stirring the backyard trees as twilight descended. I'm going to take these bottles to the recycling bin, Eliza said, gathering the empty wine and beer bottles into a bag. I'll finish loading the dishwasher, David replied, already sorting silverware. The recycling bins were kept alongside the garage in a small alcove beside the garden trellis. Eliza hummed softly as she deposited the bottles, feeling the worst of the day's tension beginning to ease. That's when she heard the scuff of a shoe on concrete behind her. She turned, expecting to see David. Instead, Richard stood there, his bulk blocking the narrow exit from the alcove. Uncle Richard, she gasped, nearly dropping the bag of bottles. I thought you left. His smile didn't reach his eyes. And miss saying a proper goodbye to my favorite niece? Never. Eliza's throat went dry. Richard took a step closer, backing her against the trellis. You embarrass me today, he said, his voice deceptively calm. In front of everyone. That wasn't my intention, Eliza replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I think we all just had too much to drink. Richard's laugh was harsh. Always the diplomat, just like your mother. Always thinking you're above it all. He was close enough now that she could smell the alcohol on his breath, stronger than before. He must have been drinking in his car. Where's your date? Eliza asked, trying to distract him while her eyes darted toward the house. How long before David wondered where she was? She's waiting in the car, Richard said dismissively. Women like her are a dime a dozen. Not like you Bennetts, thinking you're special. His hand shot out suddenly, gripping Eliza's arm. You turned your father against me. Your mother started it, and you finished the job. Pain shot through Eliza's arm as his fingers dug into her flesh. Uncle Richard, you're hurting me, she said, hating the tremor in her voice. Let go. Instead, his grip tightened. You know what your problem is, Eliza? You've never been put in your place. Your parents spoiled you, and now that husband of yours treats you like you're made of glass. With his free hand, he grabbed a half-empty wine glass someone had left on the nearby garden table. Let's see how perfect you look with this all over that expensive blouse. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs as she struggled to pull away. Stop it, David will. David will what? Richard sneered. Call the cops on me? Press charges? I'm family, sweetheart. And family protects their own, something you seem to have forgotten. In a flash of movement, Richard hurled the wine glass. Eliza flinched as it shattered against the fence beside her head, sending glass and red wine spattering across her blouse and the side of her face. A small shard nicked her cheek, a bead of blood mixing with the wine droplets. You think you're so much better than everyone else now, don't you? Richard hissed, his face contorted with rage. Little Miss Perfect with her fancy house and her fancy husband. Panic froze Eliza in place as childhood fears resurfaced like ghosts. The 12-year-old girl who had watched him terrorize her aunt was suddenly present again, trapped in her adult body. Then a shadow fell across them both. Get away from my wife. David's voice was calm, but carried a deadly undercurrent that promised consequences. Richard turned, his lip curling. Well, if it isn't the White Knight right on cue. David stepped forward, his tall frame tense with controlled fury. I said, get away from her. Now. For a moment, Richard seemed to consider his options, his eyes flicking between David and Eliza. Then he laughed, the sound ugly and forced. We're just having a family chat, counselor. Nothing for you to worry about. The broken glass and my wife's bleeding face suggest otherwise, David replied coldly. He moved past Richard to stand beside Eliza, his arm going around her shoulders. Are you okay? He asked softly. She nodded, though her whole body was trembling. David's attention returned to Richard. You need to leave our property immediately. And don't ever come back. Richard's face darkened. You don't get to tell me when I can see my family, boy. Actually, I do, David replied. This is our home, and you've assaulted my wife. I could call the police right now and have you arrested for assault and trespassing. He pulled out his phone from his pocket. In fact, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Something shifted in Richard's expression, a flicker of uncertainty replacing the bravado. You wouldn't dare. Thomas would never forgive you for having his brother arrested. Eliza found her voice then, stronger than she expected. My father would never forgive you for what you just did, Uncle Richard. And neither will I. She stepped forward, out of David's protective embrace. This ends now. The manipulation, the intimidation, the violence, it's over. You are not welcome in our lives anymore. Richard's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little. Choose your next words very carefully, David cut in, his finger hovering over his phone. I've already dialed 911. One tap, and they'll be on their way. For several tense seconds, the only sound was Richard's heavy breathing. Then, abruptly, his shoulders slumped. Fine. Have it your way. Turn the family against me. See if I care? He took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. You're just like her, you know. Thinking you're too good for your own blood. Without waiting for a response, he turned and stalked toward the front of the house, disappearing around the corner. David immediately pulled Eliza into his arms. Are you sure you're okay? Your face, it's just a scratch, she said, though her voice shook. Did you really call 911? David shook his head. No, but he didn't need to know that. I would have, though. In a heartbeat. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, careful to avoid the small cut on her cheek. This has gone on long enough, Liz. We need to talk to your dad. Eliza nodded, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving her exhausted. I know. I should have done it years ago. They walked back to the house together, David's arm protectively around her waist. Inside, Eliza went to the bathroom to clean the wine and blood from her face while David made her a cup of tea. When she emerged, he was on the phone. Yes, Tom, she's okay. Just a small cut, but that's not the point. I think you should come over. Yes, now would be good. He hung up and turned to Eliza. Your dad's on his way. I didn't give him details, just said we needed to talk. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later, his face lined with concern. When Eliza explained what had happened, showing him the bruises already forming on her arm, his face went ashen. I had no idea he would. I never thought he'd actually hurt you, he said, his voice breaking. Dad, This isn't the first time, Eliza said gently. You remember what happened with Aunt Margaret? Thomas nodded slowly. I told myself that was different. That Margaret provoked him somehow. God, I was so blind. He covered his face with his hands. My own brother. And I made excuses for him my whole life. David sat beside Thomas on the couch. It's not too late to stop making excuses, Tom. Eliza wants to press charges, and I think she's right. Thomas looked up sharply. Charges? You mean have him arrested? Assault and battery, for starters, David replied. He needs to face consequences, or this behavior will never stop. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the bruises on his daughter's arm. Your mother always said I was too forgiving with Richard, he finally said. She saw through him before any of us did. He reached for Eliza's hand. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have protected you better. Eliza squeezed his hand. It's not your fault, Dad. Richard is responsible for his own actions. And now he needs to answer for them, David added firmly. We'll go to the station tomorrow to file a report. And we should talk to Melody too, make sure she understands that Richard isn't to be around Lily. Thomas nodded, straightening his shoulders. I'll go with you. It's time I stopped enabling him. He looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with resolve. No more family gatherings with Richard. No more excuses. Your mother would be proud of you for standing up to him. Eliza felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. The next morning, Eliza woke early, the events of the previous day still vivid in her mind. Her cheek stung where the glass had cut her, and the bruises on her arm had darkened to a deep purple. David was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful in repose. She slipped out of bed quietly and went to make coffee, checking her phone as the machine gurgled to life. There were several texts from Melody, sent late last night after Thomas had apparently called her. Just heard what happened. Are you okay? Call me when you can. Love you. Eliza smiled faintly. The Bennett women were stronger than Richard had ever given them credit for. As she sipped her coffee by the kitchen window, watching the early morning light filter through the trees, she felt a curious sense of calm. For years, she had dreaded family gatherings, tensing whenever Richard entered a room, making herself smaller to avoid his notice. Now that fear was gone, replaced by something else, not anger exactly, but a quiet determination. David joined her a half-hour later, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. How are you feeling? He asked, kissing the top of her head. Better than I expected, she replied honestly. Like something that was suffocating me has finally been lifted. He turned her gently to face him, his eyes searching hers. No regrets about pressing charges? Eliza shook her head. None. It's not just about me anymore. It's about Lily and any other young women he might hurt if nobody stops him. David nodded, pride evident in his expression. Your dad called while you were in the shower. He's meeting us at the station at 10. Good, Eliza said simply. She thought of her mother then, Caroline Bennett, who had always tried to shield her daughters from Richard's volatility, who had recognized the danger in him even when her husband couldn't. Mom would want us to do this. The police station was quieter than Eliza had expected for a Sunday morning. Officer Jenkins, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took Eliza's statement carefully, photographing her injuries and asking detailed questions about the incident. And this isn't the first time your uncle has exhibited violent behavior, she asked, making notes on her computer. No, Eliza replied. There have been incidents over the years with other family members. My Aunt Margaret left him because of his violence. Beside her, Thomas cleared his throat. I can provide a statement about previous incidents I've witnessed, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. It's been going on for decades, and I should have spoken up sooner. Officer Jenkins nodded. That would be helpful, Mr. Bennett. We'll be issuing a warrant for Richard Bennett's arrest based on Ms. Mason's statement and evidence. She turned back to Eliza. You'll also want to file for a protection order. I can help you with the paperwork before you leave today. As they completed the necessary forms, Eliza felt David's steady presence beside her, his hand occasionally squeezing hers in silent support. Thomas sat across from them, looking simultaneously older and unburdened, as if a long-carried weight had been set down at last. "What happens now?" Eliza asked as Officer Jenkins collected the final documents. "We'll locate and arrest Mr. Bennett on assault charges," the officer explained. "Given his relationship to you and the nature of the attack, he'll likely face domestic violence charges as well. The DA's office will contact you about next steps." She handed Eliza a card. "This has my direct line. Call me if he attempts to contact you or if you remember any additional details." Outside the station, Thomas embraced his daughter tightly. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm so sorry it took me this long to stand with you against him." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and quiet conversation. Melody came over with Lily, bringing dinner and fierce support. "I always hated the way he looked at me," she confessed as they sat around the dining table. "Even when I was a teenager. It made my skin crawl." Thomas winced at her words, but didn't try to defend his brother. Instead, he listened as his daughters shared stories of Richard's behavior that they had previously kept to themselves, each revelation strengthening his resolve to see justice done. When David's phone rang shortly after 8 that evening, the room fell silent. He stepped into the hallway to take the call, returning moments later with a guarded expression. "That was Officer Jenkins," he said. "They arrested Richard about an hour ago. He's being held without bail until his arraignment tomorrow morning." A complex mixture of emotions washed over Eliza: relief, vindication, and a trace of sadness for what might have been if Richard had been a different kind of man. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. David sat beside her, taking her hand. "The legal process is just beginning," he cautioned. "But yes, in many ways, it's over. He can't hurt you anymore." Thomas nodded solemnly. "And he won't hurt anyone else in this family ever again. I'll make sure of that." Melody raised her wine glass. "To ending the cycle," she said simply. They all drank to that, even Thomas, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Eliza stood in the backyard, looking at the spot where Richard had cornered her. Already, it felt like a different place, cleansed somehow by the actions they had taken today. David joined her, draping a light jacket over her shoulders against the evening chill. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly. Eliza leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I was just thinking about how much energy I've spent over the years being afraid of him. Dreading family gatherings, tensing up whenever he entered a room, making myself small so I wouldn't attract his attention." She turned to face her husband. "I don't have to do that anymore. None of us do." David brushed a strand of hair from her face, careful to avoid the small bandage on her cheek. "No, you don't. And Lily will grow up never knowing that fear." Eliza smiled at the thought, her niece, and perhaps someday her own children, free from the shadow that had darkened her own childhood. "That makes everything worth it," she said. As they walked back into the house together, Eliza paused at the threshold, looking back at the yard where just yesterday her family had gathered. Tomorrow, they would clean up the last remnants of the party, removing all traces of Richard's violence. They would replant the trailing vines on the trellis where she had been cornered, reclaiming the space as their own. And in time, they would host other gatherings, happier ones, free from the tension that had always accompanied Richard's presence. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think next year's barbecue might be the best one yet." David smiled, understanding what she wasn't saying. "A new tradition," he agreed, closing the door behind them. Inside, their home felt different somehow, safer, as if the very walls had strengthened with their resolve. For the first time in her adult life, Eliza felt truly at peace within these rooms, within her family, within herself. The ghost of fear that had haunted her for so long had finally been exorcised, replaced by the quiet certainty that she had found her courage at last.